Hello, my friends, and welcome back. Now, today I want to discuss something for those of you who are regular listeners to this podcast. It might seem a little bit redundant, but I have a lot of new listeners, and so I wanted to readdress this again. I've talked about it in some of the early episodes, but I wanted to address this again because it comes up regularly when I talk to people, and I still hear it from those who are longtime listeners but at the same time are new to homeschooling. And today I want to talk about what to expect this first year, from what to expect yourself as well as what to expect from your kids, so that you're not shocked as you start this homeschooling journey. And I'm speaking from personal experience, so it's not scientific, my friends. This is just from my personal experience in life. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, we started homeschooling as of today. It would have been 3.5 years ago. And we started just over 3.5 years ago. We started in July of 2020. And at the time, I had an eighth grader, a seventh grader, a third grader, and then a preschooler. And and so I had all these ages, and as I've mentioned before, when we started homeschooling, all the homeschoolers that we talked to had always been lifelong homeschoolers, or they pulled their kids out in elementary school, or when their kids got to high school, they put them back in. And so my situation was different because I had kids approaching high school and I was pulling them out. And it was incredibly terrifying for us and for my kids. The good news for us is COVID was going on, so hybrid learning was happening in the school and the kids were isolated and all of that stuff. So that was a little bit, honestly, of a blessing for us because my kids didn't feel like they were completely missing out, but there was some amount of, but am I missing out? And so some things that I didn't anticipate, because people kept saying, well, you need to deschool. I didn't understand what that was. And deschooling, the short answer is the adjustment process that your children go through going into a homeschooling atmosphere versus being in a public schooling atmosphere. And nobody told me that I would have to deschool myself. And of all of the people in our little family who had the hardest time deschooling, it was me. I was the one who had the most difficult time adjusting to the homeschooling process. And so these are some things that I didn't expect. First of all, I didn't anticipate that I'd have a variety of emotions and go through the grief cycle. Um, I I didn't anticipate that for myself. I didn't anticipate that for my kids. And in a very real way, I I would get angry, I'd get frustrated, I'd feel a great deal of sadness, I'd come to resolution. Like, I felt all of these emotions, and looking back, I was going through the grief cycle. And for those who have experienced a death of a loved one, there's not specific order of things. And sometimes you might feel all of the feelings at the same time, and sometimes you don't feel any of them, and sometimes you feel one and then you skip to the other one. And that was really unexpected for me, was the feelings of fear and anger and denial and just all of the feelings, which sounds really ridiculous, but every person I've ever talked to goes through the same cycle, like of it's the grief cycle, because in a way, like, it's kind of a sort of a death. You're leaving this world that you once knew, and you're in a totally different space, and it's scary and it's hard. So if you start feeling all like feelings of anxiety, feelings of depression, and then you feel fine, totally normal. That's totally normal. um the other thing I didn't expect to experience was this complexity with my kids, going, challenging what we were doing, and then, not liking the public school system, but then coming back and liking pieces, and wanting to test, but not wanting to test. And so there's this conflict that's going on in kids, especially when they're older, where they're like, well, I hated school, but yet we're not testing like we should be in school. And there was a perpetual conflict, which lasted about a year and a half for my older kids. And then they started to let go of the public school ideologies. Um, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, when I started, we were going full throttle. I was going to do school at home. And what that was is I had bought all these curriculums for my kids. And what I expected was, they would love all the curriculums because they wanted that school structure, but they didn't want the school structure, but they did want the school structure. And it was really confusing to me, but more importantly, it was confusing to them. So when I realized that following a rigid structure wasn't going to work and doing school at home wasn't going to work. And what that is like school at home. When you hear that term, that means you have a set schedule and you're going to follow set curriculums and you're going to be the teacher and they're going to be the listener and the learner. That is school at home. And for a lot of homeschooling families, that doesn't work. Now, I know homeschooling families who do school at home and it works for them and great. Most people that I know, school at home does not work. There ends up being conflict with the child. The child wants more and more autonomy, but as human beings, we like autonomy. We want autonomy. That's one of the big dilemmas that in the workforce that they're having is more and more people are wanting autonomy, but dealing with the autonomy becomes tricky because they've always been in a system that taught them not to have autonomy. And I was in the workforce for many, many, many years in the hiring capacity and working with small business owners, as well as I did hire for some Fortune 500 companies. So this first year, you want to slow things down and you're going to want a little bit of structure. My suggestion is always like do reading, writing, math. Okay. If you're going to get curriculums, maybe get a reading curriculum, perhaps a writing curriculum, and a math curriculum. You're going to do the minimum. You're going to want to do the minimum, but have a little bit of structure. With math, again, I started with curriculums and I feel like jumping straight into unschooling for most families, it just blows people's minds. And so again, if you can at least do reading, writing, and a little bit of math. And as I've mentioned before, for writing, you could just have them copy passages out of books or recipes or whatever, to begin. If that's too scary for you, going that far back and pulling that much back, then get a simple writing curriculum. And I have somebody coming on the podcast next week, Tina Hollenbeck, and she has created a roadmap for all the curriculums that have ever been created that are out there, and it's easy to find different curriculums to fit your family if you so choose to go a curriculum route. For me, I needed those training wheels. So we did we did a math curriculum for the kids, and we did a writing curriculum. And then I ended up moving by the end of the year more towards, they'd copy passages out of a book and we do different things like that. And then we moved to for reading, I would just read with the kids. When we started like read alouds as a family, my little kids had no issues with read alouds because I read to them every night, storybooks. But my older kids were really resistant to read alouds. And at the beginning, we could only do a read aloud for a few minutes. Like I'm talking like 5 minutes before they're like, do we have to keep listening to this? Again, there was all this conflict going on inside of them. There was conflict going on inside of me. And so we had to pull way back. As Joshua, in an earlier episode, I interviewed my 16, almost 17-year-old, and he said he felt a lot of anger and frustration, and I had all this stuff planned out and things weren't going according to plan. And so we really had to pull back, but I couldn't just go straight to unschooling. For those that are new and have never heard that term, unschooling is child-led learning. It's a philosophy. It's an educational philosophy. Unschooling and deschooling are two different things. Deschooling is the process, the adjustment process from public school. Unschooling is a philosophy where you it's a homeschooling. It's an educational philosophy where you allow the child to choose the things that they learn, to follow their passions, and then you provide the resources for them to learn those things. Whether it's guitar or math or whatever they so choose. So we didn't jump into unschooling right away. I mentally could not have done that. It would have been too hard. So, but we started with reading, writing, and math. I'd have the kids read individually, and then I'd read together with them. They were used to reading, having to do 20 minutes a day because of public school. That was part of their homework in the school that my kids were in. They were expected to read 20 minutes a day, and we'd fill out a reading log and whatnot and send it back to the school. So reading 20 minutes a day was not a shocker to my kids. That was familiar to them. But reading aloud with my older kids was not familiar, other than reading scripture. We didn't read much aloud to the kids when they got older, just when they were younger. But again, it took several months until they were okay reading longer and longer with me. When we started listening to audiobooks in the car and the books were really interesting, we had a captive audience and they really enjoyed it. One of the things I learned, because I tried trudging through a couple books that they did not like, and frankly, it wasn't enjoyable for me because they didn't like it. I had to learn that if it wasn't working, to stop doing it. I had this mindset myself that we had to get through a curriculum or we had to get through a book, or else, we weren't effective. And I had to let go of that. If it's not working, then you switch, you make an adjustment. You give it a couple weeks. If it doesn't work, you move on, and it's okay. That was really hard for my brain to get to wrap around, like, oh, the kids don't like this book. I need to let go of it. Let's switch books. And then when we did, the read aloud started being longer. Again, our first read alouds for the first few weeks was like 5 minutes is all I had with the kids, before the older kids were like, oh my gosh, do we have to keep it? And eventually, as I switched books and we chose more interesting books, and we'd listen in the car and we'd listen to Audible, or I'd read aloud, that time got longer and longer and longer. And until, I could read for an hour or an hour and a half, or we'd listen for an hour and a half, and they enjoyed the book and they didn't fight me anymore. I also found that if I could keep their hands busy, whether it was they're working on a puzzle, or they were drawing, or they were coloring, or they were doing something with their hands, the read alouds became much easier because that part of their brain was being occupied. They might, doing some craft. But I expected at the beginning that they would just relish in reading aloud. They'd want to, and that wasn't the case. But it took a few weeks to adjust to even reading aloud. With math, it was a little bit of a battle. At the beginning, they were gung-ho, and then after a few weeks, they're like, that shocked me. But again, there's all these things psychologically going on in their heads and in their minds, and we have to be prepared as parents to help them, help ourselves, and then adjust when necessary. So for math, we got to the point where they would do, the older kids would do 15, 20 minutes of math and they were good. And they didn't want to do anymore. Now my daughter wanted to take an algebra class. She's taking an algebra class, and she'll easily go for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, if she really wants to nail a principle or concept in her algebra class. She'll go longer, and it's a work at your own pace. But at the beginning, she could not go that long. She'd get really, really frustrated. And so we'd have to do it in short stints. For younger kids, who have been either in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, and they're used to going 8 hours a day, realistically, it's too long for them, and for their brains and for their age and for their development. You've got their age plus one, that's their attention span. And shorter lessons. I love that. That was one thing Charlotte Mason taught. And there's the Charlotte Mason philosophy, which is, you can watch another episode, the episode on philosophies that talks about Charlotte Mason. That was one of her beliefs with the Charlotte Mason philosophy, was that children need short little lessons, like little spurts, and then you move on. And so at the beginning, don't expect your kids you need those training wheels, and they actually need the training wheels too, where you might need a curriculum or, curriculums for a few subjects, or maybe the kids are like, we have to do science. Fine, get them a little science curriculum. But expect that it'll be little spurts. Teach in little spurts. Have them learn in little spurts and call it good. It will get longer for some of the kids, and some of the kids, if they're not interested in it, they may not respond very well. Another thing I didn't expect is I didn't expect that I would freak out every single week and I would cry every day. And I literally did. The first year, I cried on a daily basis that I was ruining my kids. I was worried that they weren't learning enough. I was worried that they'd never figure out their passions. I wanted them to figure out their passions right away because, and I thought, well, of course they know what they like. But the reality is when kids come out of the public school system, it takes many months for them to start figuring out who they are, what they like, what they don't like. Sometimes they'll say, oh, I'm really interested in this thing, but really it's what their friends at school were interested in and they weren't really interested in. I remember in high school, there was a group of boys from church that we'd hang out with, and they really, really loved a certain music group. Specifically, They Might Be Giants. They loved them. And so when people would say, hey, who's your favorite music group? I would always respond, well, I really like They Might Be Giants. Until I got older and took a step back and went, I actually don't, that their music doesn't jive with me. Great for them, but it doesn't jive with me. Man, I really love soundtracks. And it wasn't until I was separated from all of those friends and they had graduated and I was still in high school that I had the time to reflect and go, what do I like? What do I want? What things matter to me? Wow. The Dances with Wolves soundtrack really, really speaks to my heart. It speaks to my soul. It moves me. I really like this soundtrack. I really like I like this kind of music. I actually don't like that kind of music, but it takes time. So when sometimes I'll have moms email and say, my kids don't know what they like and when are they going to figure it out? And they're so scared. I'm like, give them time. Give them time to figure it out. And it's going to take more than a couple weeks. It's going to take more than a couple months. It might take a year. And guess what? It's okay. So grant yourself and your children grace as they're figuring out what they love and what they don't love. Grant yourself grace. On Mondays, give yourself a little pet talk because Mondays would come around and I'd want to vomit and go, we haven't learned anything. The kids are failing. I am failing my kids. Grant yourself grace and go, nope, we got the training wheels on. We are learning to ride a bike. They are learning. It just looks different than what the public school system is looking like. I kind of anticipated that I'd get challenged by people, family members and neighbors and people from school about homeschooling. I kind of anticipated that. It's inevitable. People are going to say stuff to you. It'll take you about a year to grow enough confidence some of you might be like, oh no, after 2 weeks, I'm like, no, step back. One of the things that helped me grow confidence in homeschooling was educating myself on the history of our education system, educating myself on how children learned and learn. Because once I started really studying myself, and this is some advice to you is, and I'll list a whole bunch of books that were really helpful to me. Once I started really studying, I was able to gain the confidence to respond to people and to say, hey, I know that you are a big proponent of our public school system. However, that doesn't work for my family. And if you'd like to have an in-depth discussion about it, I'm happy to do that. But what it took for me was reading and studying and really learning myself. That's what helped me gain confidence. And it also helped all of those triggers in my head that were like, you're failing and all those things. The more that I studied, the more that I read, I realized I was doing the right thing and that what I was doing was actually really good. And so I'll put a list of things that I read. And so I actually would listen to audiobooks over, and one book after the next to try to understand. And that helped me as a parent grow confident, and it helped me deschool as well. Now, these books didn't resonate with my kids because they hadn't gone through 13 years of school and then college and then, more work later. But if you can start educating yourself, you'll find that it starts to calm your fears as you go, oh my gosh, I'm reading this psychologist book and they're actually a proponent. Or I'm reading this this businessman, Dan Pink is a good example. And he wrote the book Drive. And I read that as a public school parent, and then I read it as a homeschool parent. And what I hadn't realized is at the end, he talks all about homeschooling and how important it is and great it can be. And here it's a business book that people read for their businesses, right? And so reading those things and reiterating that I was doing a good thing helped me mentally. But if you find yourself and you're like, oh my gosh, you're crying on a regular basis, know that it's okay. And it's actually not unusual. It's totally, again, it's part of the grief cycle. Some other things I didn't expect, but happened the first year is at the beginning, my kids fought. And as they started to try to figure out their relationships when they're with each other almost all day, every day, but eventually, over several months, it turned into deep friendships. Again, my son Joshua brought that up. He didn't anticipate that he'd become so close to his siblings. At the beginning, they fought. So, because people they hear my story, but they don't hear that part. That, at the beginning, they fought. And then as they figured out their relationship to each other, they became best friends. But it took time. It didn't happen overnight. That first year, again, you're learning to ride a bicycle that first year. You've got training wheels on, so you might use a few curriculums. You're trying to figure out your kids. They're trying to figure out things, and it's gonna be messy. And it's totally okay. Again, you're going through a grief cycle, and you have to give yourself grace. During this year, educate yourself. And part of the deschooling process, learn with your kids. Watch videos together. You might watch documentaries together. You might go to museums together. I made the mistake, the first museum we went to when we started homeschooling, I purchased a packet from Teachers Pay Teachers of a teacher who'd put together this whole packet for her classroom for this one museum. It was the Bob Bullock History Museum in Austin, Texas. And I was going home to go to a wedding of a friend, and we were going to go to the Bob Bullock History Museum, and I printed out this packet for my kids, and we go there and I make them fill out the packet. And within 15 minutes, they were done. And they were mad, and everyone was angry and frustrated, and the museum ended up not being fun. And it's such a fun museum, and I made it a chore for them. And I learned very quickly, what if I didn't assign them anything to do? Like, what if I'm not like, well, you're going to be graded on this, right? What I found was when I removed the expectation of you've got to fill this out or fill that out or do what I tell you to do, they started enjoying museums just for the sake of being at the museum. Like, they wanted to see and learn. I took them to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science a few months later, and they wanted to spend almost the whole day on this one floor in this one area about the human body. And I didn't give them a packet. I didn't, we just went and we just enjoyed it. And they were doing all the experiments, and they loved it. But I know that if I had given them a packet, it would have turned learning from joy into ugly work. And so I had to learn that first year, that my kids don't respond very well when I say, you have to learn what I tell you to learn right this second. Here, I'm going to shove this in your face. They don't They didn't like that. Again, like I said at the beginning, we did curriculums and we did packets and we did, oh my goodness. And it was many times a disaster. So the other thing I had to let go of was this idea of that I have to grade my kids on stuff. But they also, my older kids had to adjust from that. My little ones, not so much. They wanted me to put a sticker on their stuff. But my older daughter, who was in 7th grade at the time, she's now almost 16. She wanted me to grade, but then she'd get frustrated about the grades. Again, there's a lot of it's interesting because there's this power struggle in their brains and our brains where we're like, no, I want this, but I don't want this, but I do want this. And it's all part of the process as you're learning to adjust from this system, which frankly is kind of an abusive system. If you think about it, it's almost like an abusive relationship. You will do what you're told when you're told, and we will punish you if you don't. And I never thought about it like that. And some of you might be very angry with me for saying that, but in reality, it's almost like you're coming out of an abusive relationship and there's still that dependency of, but what if my kids fail because they tell me I'm going to fail my kids because that's what the system says. If I don't do it their way, I'm going to fail. Like, my friends, that's really destructive. But that's how I felt even the first year. And I was a teacher. My gosh. And there was perpetual conflict in my heart, and there was perpetual conflict with my kids. Again, my daughter wanted grades, but she didn't want grades. Now she wants grades. Now she doesn't want grades. And eventually we moved away from grading altogether. I do read through their stuff and I'll correct stuff and say, hey, you may want to change this, that, or the other, but I'll ask them what they think about their work. I let them judge their work. I'll correct their work. I had my son, he read something and I said, I want to see how your writing is. So let's have you write a paragraph about what you read. He wrote a paragraph. I'm like, okay. And I circled the things that need to be corrected. And I explained to him, like, this is when you use an apostrophe and this is when you don't. And this is when you need a comma and this is when you don't. And he's like, okay, cool. He's like, now I want you to rewrite it. He did not love that. But I was like, you need to rewrite it because I want you to be a good writer. An important thing in this world is being able to communicate your thoughts through the written word, whether that is through an email or you're texting or, you're writing a book or you're writing an article or whatever. I said to my 11-year-old, you have to learn how to communicate via the written word. And he's like, okay. So he rewrote it. It wasn't very long. But again, this first year, anticipate you're going to experience a lot of conflict internally. And at the beginning, you might feel super excited and then you just feel like you're failing. That's totally normal. I had all these high aspirations and then when they didn't come to fruition, I was like, I'm a loser, So there's a lot of conflict that goes on that first year as you're going through the deschooling process. I made a short video. So I started making some shorts with character. His background on me, when I was 14, I started doing sketch comedy. And I did it for many, many, many years. I got paid for it, which was kind of great. And then I stopped doing it for a long time. Well, a few months ago, I had this inkling that I want to do some homeschooling videos, which I've gotten lots of love from lots of people. And then I've also gotten some hate from a few people. And I'm like, seriously, get a sense of humor, friends. But I created a short about the sound of music because legitimately, before I started homeschooling, I imagined like, okay, my homeschooling world is going to be like Fraulein Maria, and we're going to have such a great time, and the children are going to listen to me, and I'm going to play the guitar, which is funny because I actually don't play the guitar, but I'm going to I can play the ukulele, kind of. I'm going to play, and we're just going to have this lovely experience together and learn together and climb trees. And it's going to be the sound of music. And that's not what happened. It was kind of a disaster, right? That's why I made that short, because that's what I thought it'd be like. And the response of my kids was, this sucks. Pardon my language. So this first year, I want you to be gentle with yourself. I give you permission to be gentle with yourself. I give you permission to be forgiving and loving to yourself and to your children. again, I want you to imagine that you're learning to ride a bicycle for the first time, and it's okay to have training wheels on. If you need to use curriculums, sure. And you might love them and continue on with them. Great. Do the very bare minimum, my friends. Read, write, math. If you feel like, oh no, I have to do science or whatever, do science. And then as you gain more confidence, add a few more things. I had a mom reach out to me who said, I feel like I really want my girls to do this writing program. And so I wrote back and I said, then do the writing program. My friends, I am a God-fearing person. I am a Christian. I believe in Christ. I believe in the Holy Spirit. And I believe that, especially as mothers, this is a gift that has been given to us to guide our families. And so if you're not religious, that's fine, but you still have that intuition. Whether or not you call it a spirit, it's totally up to you. But I believe the Spirit will guide you. It will guide you on what to do best, like what's the best next thing for your kids. So here this mom is like, I feel like I need to add a writing program for my kids. And I said, then add a writing program. Or I feel like I need to do XYZ for my kids, then do XYZ for your kids. And trust yourself. You know your kids better than anybody else knows them. You love them more than anybody else loves them, minus God. And he's entrusted them to you because he trusts you. So allow yourself to be guided. Allow yourself, if something's not working, it's okay in the middle of the semester to say, you know what? This curriculum is not working. It's boring for them. It's boring for me. It's a constant battle with them. They just fight me. Then put it down. It's okay if there's a couple of weeks when things are really rough and the kids don't want to do curriculums, and you set things aside and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to cook, and we're going to go on hikes, and we're going to do other things. It's okay to do that. For many of you, that's going to be hard because you're going to be like, no, but they won't be learning. And are we allowed to do that? Yes, you're homeschooling. And this amount of freedom can be terrifying. Again, it's like you're coming out of an abusive relationship. You are not used to that. I was not used to that much freedom. But once you start taking the matters into your own hands and you realize that learning doesn't have to look like it does in school. As a matter of fact, very little learning actually happens in school. Like when you look at a child's day and how much time is actually spent in a classroom learning the one thing, very little is actually happening. Like learning, you only got those poor teachers only have like a short little tiny window to teach the kids. And then they have all these transitions. Then they have all these other things, right? So once you start to understand that you have the freedom, and it's scary, but it's beautiful, but it's scary, and you allow the Spirit to guide you, beautiful things will happen. And give yourself grace. And give your children grace. They will continue to learn even if what they learn is very minimal each day. They're learning more than you think you are. And they're listening more than you think they are. That was another thing that surprised me, is I thought many times my kids were not listening to me, but in actuality, they heard everything and just pretended like they didn't hear me. But they heard it and they internalized it. And they fought me sometimes, a lot of times, especially at the beginning. They fought me a lot. At the beginning, our relationship was not great. It took many, many months till I got their hearts back. So give yourself time. And it's going to take more than a couple weeks. And those of you who are perfectionists, those of you who have OCD, you're going to want it to be right away. And I'm telling you, it's going to take time. So give yourself that. And it's okay. And educate yourself and learn with your kids. Allow yourself to have the training wheels on. It's okay. The training wheels will eventually come off. You'll eventually gain more and more confidence, and you'll get more and more ideas. but give yourself time. That's what I wanted to talk about today. It's been on my heart because I've heard from a lot of you, a lot of anxiety and what if I'm failing? What if I hear it all the time. Give yourself time. You've got to give yourself at least a year. At least a year. Don't just throw them back in public school right away just because you're like, oh my gosh, this isn't working. Give yourself time. You got training wheels on. My friends, I love you all and I legitimately pray for you. And I care about you. I understand you because I'm one of you. And I think about you moms and dads that are out there that want something better for your kids. And I get that because that's how I was. I wanted something better for my kids. And now we have it. And not that there's not always conflict. Man, Joshua and I got in an argument this week. He's been editing my videos and I got so mad. I'm like, I don't like that music. He's like, but I do. And we just, they're not going to be perfect. Everything's not going to be perfect all the time. And it's okay. It's part of life. It's part of the process, right? But that's the beautiful part is the journey. The journey is the process. The journey is the beautiful part. Enjoy it with your kids because they're not kids for very long. You got this, mamas and daddies, mamas and papas. You got this. We'll talk next week.